A rich little girl is forced by her stepmother to work in the fields. Her CEO father finds out, and what he does next. Clara never knew what it was to truly live. This phrase echoed in her mind whenever she closed her eyes at night, lying on the cold floor of the room she shared with Michael, her little brother, just 6 years old. She was 11 now, but seemed to carry decades on her thin shoulders, on her pale skin that rarely saw the sun, on her small hands that already knew the weight of adult labor. Daughter of Edward Lawson, one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, she grew up between cold walls and long silences. The large house they lived in on the outskirts of Silverwood Heights was an imposing property from the outside, with its high walls and wrought iron gates. But inside, it was a mausoleum of erased memories and stifled affections. Her mother, Helen, was the only bond of tenderness that existed within that house, too large and too lacking in love. Clara remembered her scent, something between jasmine and vanilla, the way she ran her fingers through her hair before bed, the stories she told about distant places where the sky was bluer and people smiled for no reason. Helen had a special way of making the world seem smaller and safer. When she was around, even Edward's silence, always immersed in papers and phone calls, seemed less heavy. But when illness overcame Helen's body, all that remained for Clara, then just 9 years old, was the burden of caring for her little brother Michael and enduring the presence of Sylvia, her father's new wife. Clara still remembered the day everything changed. It was a Sunday in June, when the rain lashed against the windows and the house seemed even emptier without her mother's presence. 3 months had passed since Helen had left, taken by an illness that no one explained properly to Clara. They said she was resting, that she had gone to a better place, that she was now an angel. But Clara felt the absence like a hole in her chest, something that hurt every time she took a deep breath. That Sunday, Edward arrived with a tall woman, her dark hair pulled back in a perfect bun, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed like armor. It was Sylvia. He introduced her as someone who would help take care of the house and the children. Clara, still small, didn't immediately understand what that meant. But Michael, having just turned 4, asked if she was their new mommy. Edward just looked away and mumbled something about everyone needing to adapt. At first, Sylvia's gestures were merely distant. Her eyes always evaluated, never welcomed. She moved around the house as if inspecting a newly acquired plot of land, touching the furniture, observing the paintings on the walls, frowning at any object that had belonged to Helen. Clara perceived the discomfort, but had no words to name it. Sylvia didn't shout, didn't hit, didn't make scenes. She was simply there, a presence that occupied the space like a growing shadow. With time, the demands began. First, small tasks, making the bed, folding towels, putting Michael's toys away. Then, responsibilities that didn't belong to a child, cooking, cleaning rooms, keeping Michael entertained and quiet. Any failure was met with contempt, ironies, or veiled punishments. Some days Clara woke before the sun rose, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and already found a note on the kitchen table. They were detailed instructions: prepare breakfast for your father, wash yesterday's dinner dishes, sweep the porch, put the laundry out to dry. Everything written in neat handwriting, as if it were a favor and not an order. Clara obeyed without questioning because she didn't know what else to do. Edward was rarely home. Immersed in meetings, trips, and figures, he seemed to see his children only as inconvenient distractions. His grief was never expressed. It was practical, invisible, as if Helen had evaporated from his life. The most he did was send expensive gifts, tablets, and toys, as if that could replace presents. Clara remembered a time she tried to talk to her father. It was a Friday night, when he arrived home early from the office carrying a box wrapped with a golden ribbon. Inside was a new mobile phone, one of those all the kids at school wanted. Michael was delighted, but Clara just held the object in her hands, feeling the cold weight of the glass and metal, and asked if he could have dinner with them. Edward looked at her with surprise, as if the question was absurd. He said he had work to do, that he needed to review contracts, that she should be grateful for the gift instead of asking for more. Clara didn't insist. That night, lying on the floor next to Michael, she heard her brother ask why their father never stayed with them. She didn't know what to answer. Gradually, Sylvia took over everything. With sweet words in front of others, she manipulated the image of a protective woman. But inside the house, she made rigidity a rule. When visitors appeared, she smiled, ran her hand through Clara's hair with false tenderness, offered biscuits and tea with delicate gestures. But as soon as the doors closed, the smile vanished. The instructions returned, harsher, colder, and Clara, without the courage to confront her father and without anyone to protect her, learned to survive in silence. She learned to bite her tongue when she wanted to scream, to swallow tears when she wanted to cry, to carry the weight alone so Michael wouldn't have to carry it too. The days dragged on at the farm on the outskirts of Silverwood Heights, a property far from the center, distant enough that no one would see what was happening inside. The town was small, one of those where everyone knew everyone, but the Lawson family lived in a kind of bubble. Edward was respected for being powerful, feared for being distant, and no one dared to question what happened inside that house. Clara woke early, prepared coffee, woke Michael gently, dressed him, helped with schoolwork. She herself no longer went to school. Sylvia had said there was no need, that the girl would learn more at home, that the important thing was to take care of her brother. Edward didn't question it. He never questioned anything Sylvia decided. Afterwards, while her brother played alone in the dirt yard, Clara scrubbed the porch floors, cleaned the furniture, and tried not to make too much noise. The farm was large, with empty rooms no one used, a dining room where only Edward and Sylvia ate, a spacious kitchen where Clara spent hours preparing meals she never tasted. She and Michael ate in the pantry, sitting on the floor, sharing what was left over. Anything out of place was cause for a furious glare from Sylvia, or in more serious cases for punishment. Being grounded outside the house at night, without dinner, or forbidden to see Michael for hours. The violence there didn't come with shouts, but with absences, with imposed silences, with cold and measured gestures that left invisible scars. Clara knew that wasn't normal. Even, without anyone to compare it to, even living in isolation, she felt that something was wrong. She had vague memories of when her mother was alive, of how different things were. Helen had never made her work like this. Helen called her daughter with affection, hugged Michael unhurriedly, read stories before bed. Clara kept these memories like hidden treasures, small fragments of light in an increasingly dark world. But as the months passed, these memories became more diffuse, like photographs faded by time. Sometimes she was afraid of forgetting her mother's face, the sound of her voice, the way she said her name. The only thing left of Helen was a simple silver bracelet with the letters H and E engraved on the inside. Clara wore it hidden under her long sleeve because she knew Sylvia wouldn't like it. Once, her stepmother saw the jewelry shining on the girl's wrist and asked where it came from. Clara lied, said she had found it in the yard. Sylvia didn't believe her, but also didn't insist. She just said that worthless objects shouldn't be worn, that Clara looked like a beggar with it. But Clara never took it off. The bracelet was all that still connected her to her mother, the only tangible piece of a past that seemed increasingly distant. Michael, being younger, didn't quite understand what was happening. He missed his mother, cried at night calling for her, but gradually got used to the new routine. Clara did everything to protect him so he wouldn't carry the same burden she carried. When Sylvia told Michael to be quiet, Clara invented silent games. When there wasn't enough food, Clara said she wasn't hungry and gave her portion to her brother. When he had nightmares, she held his hand until he fell, back asleep. Clara knew that if she lost Michael, there would be nothing left. He was the only reason she could still get up every morning. But there were days when exhaustion won. Days when Clara looked at her own hands, calloused and rough, and didn't recognize the girl she used to be. She remembered when she played in the yard, when she laughed for no reason, when she thought the world was a safe place. Now, the world was just this house, these walls, these silences, and Clara felt trapped, like a bird in an invisible cage. She didn't know where to go, had no one to turn to. Edward was a distant, almost ghostly figure. Sylvia was the absolute owner of that space, and she, Clara, was just a shadow, someone who existed to serve, to obey, to disappear. Everything changed one autumn afternoon. The sky was grey, laden with heavy clouds that promised a storm. The air had that smell of wet earth that comes before the rain. Clara was in the kitchen, washing lunch dishes, when she heard the sound of something breaking in the living room. Her heart pounded. She dropped the sponge and ran, her still wet hands slipping on the doorknob. Entering the room, she saw Michael huddled in a corner, eyes wide with fear, and Sylvia standing next to a broken vase on the floor. Her stepmother looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't decipher, something between anger and calculated coldness. Sylvia pointed to the porcelain shards scattered on the floor and said, in a voice that was too calm, that Clara was responsible for it. She said that she had left the girl in charge of the house, and now a valuable object was destroyed. Clara tried to explain, said she was in the kitchen, that she hadn't done anything, that Michael might have accidentally bumped into it. But Sylvia wouldn't listen. She just repeated that Clara was irresponsible, that she was useless, that she was a disappointment. Then, without warning, she grabbed Michael by the arm and dragged him to the bedroom, locking the door from the outside. The boy began to cry, banging on the door, calling for Clara. But Sylvia just turned her back and left, leaving the children alone with the muffled sound of Michael's crying. Clara stood there, frozen in the middle of the room, looking at the shards on the floor. She felt something breaking inside her too, something that had been cracking little by little and finally shattered. She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine, that she could bear it, that just obeying was enough. She needed help. She needed someone to see her, someone to realize what was happening. That afternoon, she waited for her father to arrive. When Edward walked through the door, bringing with him the smell of cigarette smoke and expensive perfume, Clara went to him. She was trembling, words caught in her throat, but she managed to speak. She said that Sylvia had locked Michael in the room for no reason. She said they were scared. She said they needed help. Edward looked at his daughter with a tired expression. He sighed, ran a hand over his face, and said that Clara was exaggerating, that Sylvia was just trying to educate them, that children needed limits, that he trusted his wife's judgment. Clara felt tears welling up, hot and heavy, running down her face. She pleaded. She said it wasn't an exaggeration, that it was true that they weren't well, but Edward just lowered his eyes, as he always did. It was as if her and her brother's existence was an inconvenience he tolerated out of obligation. He mumbled something about having work to do and went up to his office, leaving Clara alone in the hallway. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat by the door of the room where Michael was locked, whispering to him through the wood, telling him she was there, that she wouldn't abandon him. When Sylvia finally opened the door, it was already dawn. Michael stumbled out, his eyes swollen from crying, and threw himself into his sister's arms. Clara hugged him tightly, feeling his small body tremble against hers. It was at that moment that she decided. Enough was enough, no matter the fear, no matter what came next. She had to get Michael out of there. She had to escape. The next day, Sylvia was different. There was something cold and determined in her gestures. She packed a small backpack, threw in some children's clothes, a bottle of water, and a piece of bread. Clara watched in silence, not understanding what was happening. When Sylvia finished, she looked at Clara and said they were going for a walk. Clara took Michael's hand, her heart beating erratically, and followed her stepmother to the front door. But instead of taking the car, Sylvia walked to the farm gate, opened it, and pointed to the dirt road that stretched ahead. Without saying anything, she handed the backpack to Clara and gave a single instruction. Keep going. Clara froze. Michael squeezed her hand, confused, asking where they were going. Sylvia didn't answer. She just turned her back and went back into the house, closing the gate behind her. Clara heard the sound of the lock clicking shut, a metallic sound that echoed in the afternoon silence. She looked at the road, at the dust rising with the wind, at the sky beginning to darken. There was nothing else to do. She adjusted the backpack on her back, held Michael's hand tightly, and began to walk. And that's what Clara did. With Michael by the hand, she walked aimlessly, carrying only the weight of the silver bracelet she inherited from her mother, a symbol of everything that was once love. The road was long and dusty. Clara didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't go back. Every step was an effort, her legs aching, her mouth dry. Michael complained of tiredness, said he wanted to go back, that he wanted water. Clara stopped occasionally, opened the backpack, gave small sips to her brother, said they would soon arrive somewhere. But she herself didn't believe it. She just walked because she didn't know what else to do. The afternoon gave way to dusk, the sky tinged with orange and purple. The trees on both sides of the road formed long shadows, and Clara began to feel afraid. Afraid of the dark, afraid of being alone, afraid of not being able to protect Michael. It was already dark when a light appeared among the trees. Clara stopped, squeezing Michael's hand, trying to see better. It was a simple little house, smelling of wood and smoke. There was a faint light in the window, and Clara heard the sound of firewood crackling. She hesitated. She didn't know who lived there, didn't know if she could trust them, but Michael was exhausted, almost falling asleep on his feet, and she herself felt her legs weakening. She took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and walked to the door of the little house. She knocked slowly, 3 short knocks. There was a silence, then the sound of shuffling footsteps. The door opened, and an old man appeared, with white hair and a wrinkled face. He looked at the 2 children with surprise, his eyes wide. It was Old Man Arthur, a quiet and kind man who was surprised to see 2 children alone, but who didn't hesitate to offer shelter. He asked where they came from, what they were doing there at that hour. Clara didn't know how to lie. She just said they were lost, that they needed a place to spend the night. Old Man Arthur looked at Michael, who could barely keep his eyes open, and gestured for them to come in. The warmth of the stove, the hot milk, the rough blankets, everything seemed more cozy than anything Clara remembered from her own home. She didn't say much, just that she needed to rest. Old Man Arthur respected that. He made a makeshift bed near the fireplace, brought more blankets, and said they could stay as long as they needed. That night, Clara lay beside Michael, listening to her brother's quiet breathing, feeling the warmth of the fire on her back. For the first time in a long time, she felt something akin to peace. She didn't know what would come next, didn't know if they were safe, but at that moment, there, they were okay. And that was all that mattered. Clara woke to the sound of birds singing. It took her a few seconds to remember where she was. The smell of wood smoke, the rough blanket over her body, the soft morning light entering through the window. She turned her head and saw Michael still sleeping beside her, his breathing calm, his face finally relaxed. It had been so long since she had seen her brother sleep like that, without nightmares, without waking up in the middle of the night crying. Clara felt such immense relief that it almost hurt. In the following days, the presence of the 2 began to transform his routine. Michael listened to the old man's stories with enchantment, and Clara, even exhausted, offered help in everything: sweeping, planting, taking care of the chickens. It was as if her body had always known how to work. Old Man Arthur was a man of few words, but of kind gestures. He woke early, before the sun rose, and prepared strong black coffee, bread with butter, sometimes a piece of cheese. Clara wasn't used to eating breakfast. In Edward's house, she prepared the food, but rarely ate with them. Here, Old Man Arthur insisted that she sit at the table, that she eat slowly, that she enjoy it. At first, Clara felt uncomfortable. She had the feeling that she was intruding, that she didn't deserve such kindness. But little by little, she allowed herself to relax. Michael, more uninhibited, already treated the old man as if he were a grandfather. He had always had. Old Man Arthur's cottage was simple but welcoming. It had 2 small bedrooms, a living room with a wooden table worn by time, a kitchen where everything was within reach, and a porch facing a patch of land where he planted corn, beans, and some vegetables. In the back there was a noisy chicken coop and a well from which he drew fresh water. Everything was rustic, but there was an order to it, a feeling that everything was in its right place. Clara liked to sit on the porch at dusk, watching the sky change. Color, listening to the sound of crickets. It was a peace she didn't know, a tranquility that seemed impossible after everything she had lived through. Michael adapted quickly. He ran around the yard, played with the chickens, helped old man Arthur fetch firewood. The old man told stories about the town, about what Silverwood Heights was like 50 years ago when there was no asphalt on the main streets, when families gathered in the square on Sundays after church. Michael listened with sparkling eyes, asking questions, laughing at the old man's jokes. Clara watched from afar, feeling something tighten in her chest. It was good to see her brother happy, but at the same time, there was a guilt that wouldn't leave her in peace. She knew that this couldn't last forever. She knew that sooner or later they would have to decide what to do, where to go. But for now, she just wanted Michael to have those days. She wanted him to keep those memories, to know that not everything in life was suffering. Old man Arthur never asked where they came from. He perceived that Clara didn't want to talk about it, and he respected that. But sometimes when Michael was playing outside and Clara was helping in the kitchen, he would make a comment about how children needed care, attention, someone to look out for them. Clara just nodded, her hands busy washing dishes or peeling potatoes. She knew the old man was trying to understand, but she didn't have the courage to tell him. She didn't even know where to start. How to explain that her own father had abandoned them, that her stepmother had driven them out of the house as if they were unwanted strangers. How to put into words the loneliness, the fear, the exhaustion she had carried since her mother had left. It was on one of those days that old man Arthur noticed the bracelet on Clara's wrist. She was hanging clothes on the line, her arms raised, and her blouse sleeve went up a little, revealing the silver bangle. The old man stopped what he was doing, his eyes fixed on the object. Clara noticed his gaze and quickly pulled down her sleeve, hiding the jewelry. But it was too late. Old man Arthur had seen it. He remained silent for a moment, his face contorted as if he was trying to remember something. Then, without saying anything, he went back inside the house. Clara stood there, her heart pounding, not knowing what had happened. Had she done something wrong? Was he going to send them away? That night, after Michael fell asleep, old man Arthur called Clara to the porch. He had 2 cups of tea in his hands and offered one to her. Clara accepted, still nervous, and sat in the rocking chair beside him. The old man remained silent for a while, just rocking slowly, his eyes lost on the dark horizon. Then he began to speak. He said that many years ago, when he was younger, he had worked for an important family in the region. He was a driver for a businessman, a powerful man who had businesses in several cities. His name was Edward Lawson. Clara felt her entire body freeze. She gripped the teacup so tightly she almost broke it. Old man Arthur continued speaking, his voice low, and paused. He recounted that he had known Helen, Edward's wife, back in the days when the couple still had hope in their eyes. He said she was a kind woman, with an easy smile, who treated everyone with respect, from the servants to the important guests. Old man Arthur remembered seeing Helen wearing a silver bracelet with the letters H and E engraved on the inside. It was a gift from Edward given on their wedding day. That simple piece of jewelry, with the letters H and E engraved on the inside, brought back memories he thought had been erased. Clara couldn't hold back the tears. They streamed hot down her face, and she didn't even try to wipe them away. Old man Arthur reached out and gently touched her shoulder. He said he imagined that Clara and Michael were Helen's children, that he didn't know what had happened, but he could see in the girl's eyes the same sadness he had seen in Helen's eyes years ago. Clara sobbed, her words coming out jumbled, telling everything. She told about her mother's illness, about Sylvia, about the punishments, about her father who was never present, about the day they were kicked out of the house. Old man Arthur listened to everything in silence, just shaking his head occasionally, his face marked by the pain of hearing it all. When Clara finished speaking, she felt empty, as if she had lifted an enormous weight from her chest, but at the same time as if she had exposed a wound that hurt too much. Old man Arthur remained silent for a long time. Then he said that he needed to think about what to do, that he couldn't simply ignore it, that the children needed protection, someone to truly care for them. But he also knew that interfering in the life of a powerful family like Edward Lawson's could bring problems. He was just an old man living alone in a small house in middle of nowhere. Who would listen to him? Who would believe him? But old man Arthur was not a man to stand idly by. He spent the following days thinking, sifting through memories, trying to decide what to do. It was then that he remembered having saved Edward's office address from when he still worked for him. He decided to write a letter. He didn't say much, only that there were 2 children there, one of them wearing a bracelet that Edward might recognize. He said he thought it was important for Edward to know that perhaps there was something he could do. Old man Arthur wasn't sure if the letter would arrive, or if Edward would even care, but he had to try. And so the past began to stir. Meanwhile, at the farm, Clara and Michael's absence did not go unnoticed. Sylvia, in the first few days, seemed relieved. She moved around the house with more lightness, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But gradually, noticing Edward's silence and the children's absence, she began to act. Edward had returned from a business trip and asked about the children. Sylvia, with all the calm in the world, said that they had gone to spend a few days with a distant aunt, someone whose name she couldn't quite remember. Edward accepted the explanation without questioning. After all, he never questioned anything Sylvia said. But after a week, when Edward asked again and Sylvia gave the same vague answer, he began to get suspicious. He asked for the aunt's phone number, said he wanted to talk to the children. Sylvia was speechless. She stammered, made excuses, said the aunt didn't have a landline, that she lived in a rural area with no signal. Edward frowned. For the first time in a long time, he was paying attention. Sylvia realized she needed to change her strategy. She went to the neighboring town, looking for the children, spreading the word that they had run away and that she feared for their safety. She appeared at the police station, filed a report, cried in front of the detective saying she was desperate. But something was wrong. Her speech seemed rehearsed, and some people began to suspect. Edward received the letter days later, amidst contracts and notifications. He was in his office, surrounded by papers, when his secretary handed him a simple envelope with no return address. He almost threw it in the trash, thinking it was some advertisement, but something made him open it. Inside was a handwritten letter in the shaky script of someone not used to writing. The words were few, but direct. They said that 2 children were sheltered on a farm on the outskirts of Silverwood Heights. One of them wore a silver bracelet with the letters H and E. The name Helen, written there, made him freeze. Edward read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. Helen. It had been so long since he had heard that name, since he had truly thought of her. He had forced himself to forget, to bury the memories along with her body, but now, suddenly, everything came back. The bracelet, the initials, the children. He felt something tighten in his chest, something he no longer knew how to name. Guilt? Remorse? Fear? He didn't know. He only knew that he had to go there, that he had to see with his own eyes. Against all the pressures of his schedule, he decided to go to old man Arthur's farm. The journey was long. Edward drove alone without telling anyone, without saying where he was going. He followed the vague directions in the letter, asking locals along the way, until he finally found the small house hidden among the trees. When he parked the car and got out, he saw an old man sitting on the porch. It was old man Arthur. They recognized each other immediately, even after so many years. Edward greeted the old man with a nod, his posture rigid, his face closed. Old man Arthur simply pointed to the yard. There Edward saw Clara. She was thin, much thinner than he remembered. Her hands calloused, her skin sunburned, her hair tied in an awkward ponytail. She was helping Michael put seeds in the ground, both squatting, focused on the task. Michael laughed at something Clara had said, and the girl smiled too, a small but genuine smile. Edward froze. At first he maintained his cold demeanor, but upon seeing Clara, thin, with calloused hands, helping Michael put seeds in the ground, something inside him snapped. It was impossible not to recognize Helen's eyes in his daughter. She had the same deep brown eyes with that sparkle that seemed to carry the whole world. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The guilt he had pushed away for years resurfaced like a blow. How had he let things get to this point? How had he been so blind, so absent, so cowardly? He stood there, by the car, not knowing what to do. Old Man Arthur approached and said softly that the children were fine, that they were safe, but that they needed their father. Edward swallowed hard and walked to the yard. Clara saw her father approaching and froze. Michael looked up, and his eyes widened. For a moment, no one moved. Edward stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression strained. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Finally, he said her name. Clara. His voice came out hoarse, trembling. Clara didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on her father, waiting for an explanation, for an apology, for anything that would show he cared. But Edward didn't know how to do that. He had spent years running from emotions, burying feelings, building walls around himself. Now before his daughter, those walls seemed insurmountable. Old Man Arthur, sensing the discomfort, invited everyone inside. He served coffee, offered biscuits, tried to break the ice. Michael, always more open, asked his father why he had taken so long to visit them. Edward didn't know what to answer. He mumbled something about work, about not knowing where they were, about being worried. But Clara saw through the words. She knew her father was lying, or at least omitting. She knew he had chosen not to see, not to ask, not to care. And now he was there, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of obligation, but not out of love. At least not. Yet, Edward began to visit the farm frequently, trying, still not knowing how, to get closer to the children. He would arrive on weekends, bring gifts that the children barely touched, sit on the porch trying to strike up a conversation. Michael, little by little, began to open up. He talked about the chickens, about Old Man Arthur's stories, about how he had learned to plant beans. Edward listened, nodding, trying to seem interested. But Clara kept her distance. She was polite, but cold. She answered questions with monosyllables, didn't look her father in the eye, showed no affection. Edward felt the rejection like a knife, but he knew he deserved it. It was during one of these visits that Old Man Arthur pulled Edward aside for a private conversation. The two stood on the porch after the children had gone to sleep, and the old man told him things as they were. He said that Clara had suffered, that she had carried a burden that wasn't hers, that she had been abandoned when she needed it most. He said that it wasn't enough to show up occasionally, bring gifts, try to compensate with material things. Clara needed presence, attention, someone who truly saw her. Edward listened in silence, his jaw clenched, his gaze lost on the horizon. He knew Old Man Arthur was right, but knowing didn't make things easier. He didn't know how to be a father. He never had. Meanwhile, Sylvia was restless. She was sure the children hadn't gone anywhere, that someone had taken them in. And she needed to find them before they started talking, before they told things that shouldn't be told. She began to investigate, asking questions in town, visiting isolated farms. At the same time, Clara found an old photo among her mother's belongings, hidden in the binding of a book. Old Man Arthur had kept some of Helen's things, objects that Edward had left behind when he moved from the old house. Clara was looking at a book of poetry when she felt something strange in the spine. She carefully poked at it and found a yellowed envelope. Inside was a photo. In the picture, Helen smiled beside a man who wasn't Edward. They were in a park, the sun hitting their faces, their expressions relaxed and happy. The man had his arm around Helen's shoulders, and she looked at the camera with a sparkle in her eyes that Clara had never seen in photos with her father. On the back of the photo, there was a date, 10 years ago, before Clara was born, and a handwritten phrase, "Forever, my love." Clara stared at that image, trying to understand. Who was that man? What did he mean to her mother? And why had Helen hidden that photo? This sparked doubts in Clara that she didn't yet know how to name. She showed the photo to Old Man Arthur, hoping he knew something. The old man took the image in his hands, his eyes narrowing as he observed. He remained silent for a while, then sighed deeply. He said he knew that man. He was an old friend of Helen's, someone she had known before marrying Edward. Old Man Arthur didn't know much, only that they had been very close, that there had even been rumors of a relationship. But then Helen married Edward, and the man in the photo disappeared from her life. At least, That's what everyone thought. Clara felt a tightness in her chest. Had her mother harbored feelings for this man? Had the marriage to Edward been a mistake from the beginning? Was that why Helen always seemed so sad? Unanswered questions began to pile up in Clara's head. She wanted to understand, wanted to know the truth about her mother, about her family, about everything that had happened. But at the same time, she was afraid of what she might discover. Sometimes she thought it was better not to know. It was better to keep the image of her mother as a kind and loving woman, without complications, without secrets. But the photo was there, real and undeniable. And Clara knew that sooner or later, she would have to face the truth, no matter how painful. Edward also began to sift through his memories. After several visits to Old Man Arthur's farm, after seeing his children there, trying to rebuild some normalcy, he realized he could no longer escape the past. He remembered his last conversations with Helen, her silences, her unheard requests. He remembered how she tried to make conversation at dinner, asking about his day, trying to share stories about the children. But he was always too tired, too distracted, too busy. He answered with monosyllables, looked away, went back to the documents. He brought home. Helen, little by little, had stopped trying. Dinners became silent, conversations increasingly rare, until there was practically nothing left between them but routine. Edward remembered one night, a few months before Helen passed away. She had entered his office bringing a cup of tea and had sat in the armchair beside the desk. She stayed there in silence, just looking at him, waiting for him to notice her presence. But Edward was immersed in a financial report, marking numbers, making notes. After about 15 minutes, Helen got up, left the cup on the table, and left without saying anything. Edward hadn't even noticed. Only the next day, seeing the cup still there, cold and untouched, did he realize she had been there. But it was too late to ask what she wanted. And now, recalling that night, Edward felt a pain in his chest that he couldn't alleviate. One day, while at the farm, Old Man Arthur handed him an old envelope, left by Helen before she died, but never sent. The old man said he had found it among some belongings Edward had left behind years ago when he moved after Helen's passing. Old Man Arthur had kept the things in an old box in the attic, thinking that one day Edward might want them back. Inside the envelope was a letter. Edward took the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was Helen's, that delicate script he would recognize anywhere. He sat on the porch away from the children's eyes and began to read. In the letter, Helen spoke of the fear she felt that her daughter would grow up learning the same language of silence that had destroyed her. She wrote that she had tried to be strong, to be present, to be everything the children needed, but that she felt she was failing. She said she saw in Clara the same sadness that she herself carried, and that it broke her in half. Helen wrote about the days when she woke up without strength, the days when she could barely get out of bed, the days when she looked at her children and felt unable to protect them, and she asked, she pleaded, that Edward take care of Clara, that he be gentle with her, that he see the girl, that he listen to what she had to say, that he not let her disappear into silence as she herself had disappeared. She asked that, if one day Edward found himself with Clara again, he be gentle, that he start over, even if it was late. Edward read the letter to the end, tears streaming down his face without him noticing. He folded the paper carefully, put it back in the envelope and sat there, looking at nothing. Helen had seen everything. She had seen what was happening. She had tried to warn him, and he hadn't listened. He had failed her, and now he was failing his daughter. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still time to fix things. Perhaps he could still do something right. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to try. That same day, Edward made a decision. He could no longer leave things as they were. He needed to understand what had happened. He needed to know the truth about Sylvia, about how the children had ended up there. He returned to the farm where he lived and, for the first time in years, confronted Sylvia. He found her in the living room, arranging flowers in a vase, her face serene as always. Edward closed a door behind him and asked directly where the children were when she said they had gone to an aunt's house. Sylvia hesitated for a fraction of a second, but quickly recomposed her mask. She said she had already explained that it was just a few days' visit, that there was no cause for concern. Edward did not accept the answer. He took a step forward, his voice firmer than ever. He said he had found Clara and Michael, that he knew they were not with any aunt, that they were sheltered in a stranger's house because they had been expelled. Sylvia turned pale. She tried to deny it, said Edward was mistaken, that the children had run away on their own, that she had even filed a police report. But Edward was no longer listening. He said he knew she was lying, that he had proof, that he had witnesses. In truth, he didn't have anything concrete yet, but the expression on Sylvia's face said it all. The tension grew when a lawyer arrived at the farm with Helen's documents. Edward had hired a professional to review all the papers Helen had left, everything that was stored in boxes in the office. The lawyer brought a folder full of documents, old wills, certificates, property records, but the most important was an informal declaration of desire for guardianship in case of death addressed to Edward, but never filed. Helen had written in her own hand that she wished the children to remain under their father's care, but that if he could not or would not care for them, they should be entrusted to a trusted family, never to strangers or people who had no emotional ties to them. The document had no formal legal value, but it clearly showed Helen's will. And more importantly, it showed that she feared something might happen to her children. Edward read the document several times, feeling the weight of each word. Helen knew. She knew he wasn't present, that he wasn't taking care of the children as he should. And yet, she had trusted him. She had believed that somehow he would do what was right. Edward felt a shame so deep that he could barely breathe. How had he failed so much? How had he let everything get to this point? He looked at Sylvia, who was on the other side of the room, her arms crossed, her expression tense. She realized she was losing control, that Edward was finally opening his eyes, and that frightened her. At the same time, rumors spread in town that Sylvia didn't just want to find the children. She was interested in the money Edward allocated monthly for the family's upkeep. A neighbor told another that she had seen Sylvia in town, asking about bank accounts, about how to access funds held in the children's names. Another person mentioned that Sylvia had tried to sell jewelry that belonged to Helen, objects that should have been kept for Clara. The rumors spread quickly and soon reached Edward's ears. He was furious. He decided to investigate on his own. Upon investigating, Edward discovered that Michael wasn't even listed in the recent school records of the private school where Sylvia claimed he was enrolled. He called the school secretary, asked to verify his son's enrollment, and the attendant said there was no record of a child with that name. Edward insisted, gave the birth date, the surname, but nothing. Michael was not enrolled. Sylvia had lied. Edward felt anger rising. And Clara? He asked about Clara too. The attendant checked and said the girl had been withdrawn from the school more than a year ago, at the request of the legal guardian. In other words, Sylvia had taken Clara out of school and had never enrolled Michael. The children were isolated, invisible, as if they didn't exist. There were too many gaps. Edward confronted Sylvia again, this time with the documents in hand. He showed the school records, or the lack thereof, and demanded an explanation. Sylvia tried to defend herself. She said she had decided to homeschool the children, that she thought it was better that way, that they didn't need school. But Edward didn't accept it. He knew it was a lie, knew that Sylvia simply wanted to keep the children hidden, without contact with the outside world, without anyone knowing what was happening inside that house. He realized, too late, that he had handed his children over to someone who didn't care about them, who saw them only as a burden. With her nerves exposed, Sylvia appeared at Old Man Arthur's farm, demanding to take the children back. She arrived by car, honking loudly, stepping out with firm strides and a face red with anger. Old Man Arthur came out to see what was happening and found Sylvia shouting that the children were her responsibility, that she had rights, that she was there to take them. Clara and Michael were inside the house, hidden, terrified by the sound of her voice. Edward arrived shortly after, having been warned by Old Man Arthur. The confrontation was inevitable. Sylvia claimed rights, being the legal wife, and accused Edward of emotionally abandoning her. She said she had done everything for those children, that she had taken care of them when he was absent, that she had sacrificed her own life to Keep that family functioning. Edward listened to everything, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. He knew every word was a lie, but he also knew he couldn't just explode. He needed to remain calm, needed to think clearly. Old man Arthur positioned himself between the two, trying to calm tempers, saying that it was neither the place nor the time to resolve things. Clara heard part of the discussion hidden behind the door. She held Michael in her arms, covering his ears, trying to protect him from the sound of the raised voices. But she heard everything. She heard Sylvia, shouting, accusing, demanding. She heard her father trying to respond, his voice louder than she had ever heard it. It was the first time she heard her father raise his voice, not in a shout, but with firmness. And for the first time, Clara felt something akin to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, her father was finally seeing the truth. Perhaps he was finally willing to fight for them. By the end of that afternoon, Edward understood that merely observing was no longer enough. He needed to act. He told Sylvia with all the firmness he could muster that the children would not return home until he was certain they would be safe. He said he would initiate legal proceedings for the children's custody, that he would do whatever was necessary to protect them. Sylvia was speechless for a moment, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected Edward to take such a drastic step. She had always managed to control him, manipulate him, make him believe what she wanted. But now, for the first time, he was rebelling, and that terrified her. Sylvia left in a fury, threatening to sue Edward, threatening to expose the family, threatening to do everything, to keep the children under her control. But Edward was not intimidated. He had made a decision, and he would not go back on it. He initiated legal proceedings for the children's custody, facing resistance, bureaucracy, and his own guilt. He hired a lawyer specializing in family law, explained the situation, presented Helen's documents, the school records, everything he had. The lawyer said the case was complicated, that it would take time, that they would need witnesses, concrete proof of neglect or abuse. But Edward was willing to do whatever it took. The town of Silverwood Heights, accustomed to quiet, became the scene of a delicate process. The news that Edward Lawson was suing his own wife for child custody spread quickly. People began to comment, speculate, and take sides. Some supported Edward, saying he was doing the right thing, that the children needed their father. Others defended Sylvia, saying she was just a woman who had tried to care for difficult children, that Edward was being unfair. But little by little, as more details emerged, as witnesses began to speak, public opinion began to shift. Reports from neighbors, records of omission, and the children's own emotional history were gathered. One neighbor recounted that she never saw Clara playing, that the girl was always working, cleaning, taking care of her brother. Another neighbor said he had found it strange when the children disappeared, that he had asked Sylvia, and she had given evasive answers. The owner of the town's grocery store said that Sylvia rarely bought enough food for a family with children, that she seemed to be saving too much. Each testimony was another brick in the construction of Edward's case, and each brick made what had happened clearer. Meanwhile, at Old Man Arthur's farm, Clara continued to care for Michael, but now under the shadow of uncertainty. She didn't know what would happen, didn't know if they would have to return to that house, if they would have to face Sylvia again. Fear was a constant presence, a weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe properly. Michael perceived his sister's tension and tried to cheer her up, telling silly jokes, bringing flowers from the yard, offering drawings he made. Clara smiled at him, trying to hide her fear, but inside she was in pieces. Edward tried to get closer, but he knew that trust cannot be imposed. It had to be earned. He began to spend more time at the farm, not just visiting, but staying there, helping with chores, talking to the children, trying to show he was present. He helped Old Man Arthur take care of the chicken coop, taught Michael how to fix a fence, sat next to Clara on the porch and just stayed there in silence, simply being present. Little by little, very slowly, Clara began to let her guard down. She still didn't completely trust him, still couldn't forget the years of abandonment, but she began to see that perhaps her father was truly trying to change. One day, while sitting on the porch, Clara asked her father why he had never been there, why he had never noticed what was happening, why he had never asked if she was okay. Edward remained silent for a long time, trying to find the right words. Finally, he told the truth. He said he had been afraid to face the pain of losing Helen, afraid of not knowing how to be a father, afraid of failing. And then he had run away. He had hidden behind work, behind distance, behind Sylvia. He admitted that he had been cowardly, that he had failed, that he had no excuse for what he had done. And he apologized. He didn't expect Clara to forgive him. He didn't think he deserved forgiveness, but he needed her to know that he was sorry. Clara listened to everything, tears streaming down her face. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, in a low voice, she said she didn't know if she could forgive him, that it had hurt too much, that she had carried too great a weight, that she had felt too alone, but she also said that perhaps with time she could try. Edward nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't expect more than that. He didn't expect things to be resolved overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt there was hope, that perhaps, just perhaps, they could start over. As the legal proceedings continued, Sylvia kept trying to reverse the situation. She hired a lawyer, presented her version of the facts, brought witnesses who spoke in her favor. She claimed she had cared for the children with love, that she had done her best, that Edward was an absent father who now wanted to appear heroic. She cried before the judge, saying she was being wronged, that she was being punished for trying to keep a family together. But Edward's lawyer was prepared. He presented the documents, the testimonies, the school records. He showed that the children had been neglected, isolated, kept invisible, and little by little, the truth began to emerge. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, everything was in suspense. The courthouse in Silverwood Heights was full. There were journalists, curious onlookers, people who wanted to see the outcome of that story that had shaken the town. Clara and Michael did not have to testify. They were too young for that, but their names were there in every document, in every testimony. The adults stood before the judge, each with their truth, their pain, and their version of the facts. Edward spoke of guilt, of regret, of the desire to do what was right. Sylvia spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of love. But her words sounded empty, rehearsed. The judge listened to everything, asked questions, requested clarifications, and when he finally brought down the gavel, deciding that the children would remain under the provisional guardianship of their father while the process continued, there was a collective sigh in the room. Clara and Michael remained silent, as they always had, but their eyes spoke more than any testimony. They knew that wasn't the end. They knew there was still a long road ahead, that there were still wounds that needed to be healed, trust that needed to be rebuilt. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. And sometimes, hope is all one needs to keep going. The process, slow and painful, exposed wounds but also opened space for something new, the possibility of reparation. In the months that followed the hearing, much changed in the lives of Clara, Michael and Edward. With provisional custody granted to their father, the children stopped living at Old Man Arthur's farm and went to live with Edward in a new house he rented in the center of Silverwood Heights. It wasn't the isolated farm where they had grown up, nor the large cold house where they had suffered. It was a small, cozy place, with windows that let the sunlight in, and a yard where Michael could play. Edward had chosen that place carefully, thinking about what the children needed. For the first time, he was thinking about them before thinking about himself. The adjustment was not easy. Clara still carried mistrust like armor, protecting herself from being hurt again. She helped around the house, cooked, cleaned, took care of Michael, not because she was forced, but because she didn't know how to do otherwise. Edward tried to convince her to relax, said she didn't have to do everything, that she was just a child and deserved to be treated as such. But Clara didn't know how to be a child. She had forgotten, or perhaps had never truly learned. Edward didn't give up. He hired a psychologist for the children, a kind woman who sat with them once a week and helped them put their feelings into words. Michael opened up quickly, talking about his fears, about confused memories of his mother, about how much he missed feeling safe. Clara took longer, but little by little, session after session, she began to speak. Edward also started going to therapy. He realized he wouldn't be able to be the father the children needed if he didn't face his own demons. In the sessions, he talked about Helen, about the marriage that had been more obligation than love, about how he had lost himself in work to avoid dealing with emotions. He talked about guilt, about fear, about the feeling of always failing. The therapist helped him understand that acknowledging mistakes was only the first step. The hard part was learning to live with them and at the same time moving forward, trying to do better. The farm, once just a place of passage, became a stage for new beginnings. Old Man Arthur continued to be a constant presence in the children's lives. Edward invited him for Sunday lunch, and the old man always appeared, bringing fruits from the yard, telling stories, making Michael laugh. Clara felt immense gratitude for that man who had taken them in when they needed it most. She knew that, without him, things might have taken a much worse turn. Old Man Arthur, in turn, felt a quiet joy seeing the children begin to blossom. He saw Clara smiling occasionally, saw Michael running around the yard without fear, saw Edward truly trying to be a father, and that filled him with hope. Sylvia, on the other hand, disappeared from their lives. After provisional custody was given to Edward, she tried to appeal, tried to reverse the decision, but each time the case returned to court, more evidence emerged against her. Witnesses kept appearing, telling stories of neglect, coldness, and small cruelties that had gone unnoticed for so long. Sylvia realized she was losing, that there was no way to win that battle. So, one winter morning, she simply vanished. She left the farm, left the town, left everything behind. No one knew where she had gone, and no one cared enough to look. Edward was relieved but also worried. He feared that Sylvia might return one day, that she might try something, that she might do something crazy. But the months passed, and she showed no signs of life. Little by little, he began to believe that perhaps she had finally given up. As time ran its course, teaching everyone there, especially Edward, that it is not enough to offer shelter. One must learn to stay. Edward began to understand that being a father was not just providing. It was not just being physically present. It was about listening, about noticing, about being attentive to the small details that made all the difference. He learned to notice when Clara was sad, even if she said nothing. He learned to sit beside Michael when the boy had nightmares and stay there until he fell back asleep. He learned to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, to help with homework, to play catch in the yard even when he was tired. He learned that love was not an abstract feeling, but a series of concrete actions, repeated day after day. Clara, little by little, began to return to being a child. Edward enrolled her in a good school, where she made friends for the first time. At first, Clara felt out of place, didn't know how to interact with the other children, felt she was different. But a girl named Beatrice took her in, sat beside her during recess, shared her snack, invited her to play. Gradually, Clara began to loosen up. She laughed more, ran in the playground, participated in games. Edward, seeing her like this, felt his heart ache. That was the daughter he should have known years ago. The girl Helen would have wanted to see grow up. He deeply regretted the lost time, but he was determined to savor every moment from then on. Michael also blossomed. Enrolled in the same school as his sister, he quickly made friends. He was a sociable and cheerful child. He loved to draw, spending hours with colored pencils and paper, creating imaginary worlds full of vibrant colors. Edward hung his drawings all over the house, on the refrigerator, on the hallway walls, in the makeshift office he had set up in a corner of the living room. He wanted Michael to know that his work was valued, that he was seen, that he was loved. And Michael felt it. He began to call Edward Dad without hesitation, ran to hug him when he came home from work, asked him to tell stories before bed. It was a simple yet profound relationship, built on presence and affection. The revelation about her mother's photo continued to trouble Clara. She had kept the image in a drawer but couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was that man? What had he meant to Helen? Had her mother been unhappy in her marriage? Had she loved someone else before Edward? Clara wanted answers but didn't know how to get them. One day, she gathered courage and asked her father. They were sitting in the living room after dinner, Michael already asleep. Clara took the photo from the drawer, handed it to Edward, and asked if he knew who that man was. Edward looked at the image, his face contorting. He knew that man. It was Daniel, an old friend of Helen's, someone she had met in college. They had dated for a few years, had been very close, but broke up when Helen decided to pursue a career in another city. Years later, she met Edward. Their relationship was quick, intense, but perhaps more practical than romantic. Edward was stable, had a promising future, offered security. Helen accepted the marriage proposal, and they got married, but Edward always knew deep down that Helen had never completely forgotten Daniel. He had found that photo once, years ago, and had pretended he didn't see it. It was easier to ignore than to face the truth. Clara listened to everything in silence, processing the information. She asked if her mother had been unhappy. Edward hesitated, then told the truth. Yes, he thought Helen had been unhappy, not because he was cruel, not because he treated her badly, but because there was a distance between them that they could never bridge. Helen was a sensitive, emotional woman who needed deep connection. Edward was rational, reserved, incapable of expressing feelings. They had lived side by side, but never truly together. And Edward knew he had contributed to that unhappiness. He had closed himself off even more after the children were born, using work as an excuse not to have to deal with the complexity of a family. And Helen, little by little, had given up trying to reach him. Clara felt a deep sadness upon hearing this. She had always idealized her parents' relationship, thinking that before everything went wrong there had been love. But now she realized that perhaps the error had been there from the beginning. Perhaps Helen had married Edward for security, not for love. Perhaps she had spent her entire life missing something she never truly had. And perhaps that was why she had left so early, tired of living a life that wasn't truly hers. Clara asked her father if he had loved her mother. Edward looked into his daughter's eyes and said with honesty that he didn't know, that he had tried, that he had wanted to, but that perhaps he didn't know what true love was, and that this was one of the things that tormented him most. That conversation changed something between Clara and Edward. For the first time, they were completely honest with each other. There were no masks, no pretenses. It was just the truth, raw and painful, but real. Clara realized that her father was also human, that he had also failed, that he also carried pains. And somehow, that helped her begin to forgive him. It wasn't an instant forgiveness, it wasn't something that happened overnight. But it was a beginning. And sometimes a beginning is all you need. Months turned into a year. The legal process was finally concluded, with Edward receiving definitive custody of the children. Sylvia never appeared to contest, and the judge, based on all the evidence presented, decided it was in the children's best interest to remain with their father. Edward cried upon receiving the news, not from sadness but from relief. Finally, legally, the children were safe. No one could take them from him, and he was determined to live up to that responsibility. Clara turned 12 that year. Edward organized a surprise party, invited her school friends, decorated the house with balloons and colorful streamers, ordered a huge chocolate cake, her favorite. Clara was speechless when she arrived home from school and saw it all. She hadn't had a birthday party since her mother had passed away. She didn't even know her father remembered the date. But there he was, wearing a ridiculous party hat, smiling from ear to ear, trying to make everything perfect. Clara felt tears welling up, but this time they were tears of happiness. She hugged her father tightly, whispering a thank you that came from the bottom of her heart. And at that moment, Edward knew he had done something right. Life didn't become perfect overnight. There were still difficult days, days when Clara woke up sad for no apparent reason, days when Michael had nightmares about Sylvia, days when Edward felt lost and didn't know what to do. But they were together, and they were trying. That was more than they had had before. Edward continued working, but now in a balanced way. He refused long trips, prioritized being home for dinner, organized weekends to be with the children. They went to the park, visited Old Man Arthur at the farm, watched movies curled up on the sofa. These were simple but precious moments. Moments that built memories, healed wounds, created bonds. Clara started writing. The psychologist had suggested she put her feelings on paper as a way to process everything she had lived through. At first, Clara wrote only short, disjointed sentences, but gradually she began to develop stories. She wrote about brave girls who faced monsters, about siblings who protected each other, about fathers who learned to love. Writing became her way of making sense of the world, of transforming pain into something beautiful. Edward read her text when she allowed him to, and was impressed by the depth of those words coming from someone so young. He saw in her Helen's sensitivity, but also a strength that was unique. Clara was a survivor, and he was immensely proud of her. One day Clara asked her father if they could visit her mother's grave. Edward hesitated. He hadn't been there since the funeral, but he agreed. They went together, the three of them, carrying white flowers. It was a sunny day. The cemetery was silent and peaceful. They stood there, in front of the simple headstone where Helen's name was engraved, and each had their moment. Michael, who barely remembered his mother, placed his hand on the stone and softly said, "Hello." Edward stood there, hands in his pockets, trying to find words, but couldn't. He just stood in silence, thinking of all that could have been different. Clara knelt, placed the flowers in the vase, and whispered a thank you. Thank you for being kind, for loving, for trying to protect, and thank you for giving her and Michael each other. As they left the cemetery, Clara felt something release within her. As if a weight she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. She still missed her mother, still wished Helen were there to see how they were starting over. But now she had peace. She knew her mother would be proud, knew she had done the best she could, and now it was time to move on, not forgetting but living, honoring Helen's memory by building a life worth living. The following years brought growth and healing. Clara became a talented teenager with plans to study literature at university. Michael continued to be a cheerful and creative child, always surrounded by friends, always laughing. Edward became the father he should have been from the beginning. He never stopped regretting the lost time, but he learned to live with that regret, transforming it into motivation to do better every day. He was present, he was attentive, he was there, and that made all the difference. The house they had rented in the center of Silverwood Heights became a real home. The walls were painted with cheerful colors, chosen by Michael. The bookshelves were filled with books Clara loved. The kitchen always smelled of homemade food. There was laughter. There were conversations. There were moments of comfortable silence. There was life. And that was all that mattered. Old Man Arthur's farm continued to be a refuge for them. The old man, now over 70, began to slow down, and Edward helped him whenever he could. They had developed a deep friendship based on mutual respect and gratitude. Old Man Arthur had saved the children when no one else could, and Edward would never forget that. One summer afternoon, as everyone was gathered on the farm porch, Clara looked around and felt immense gratitude. There was Michael, chasing, chickens laughing loudly. There was Old Man Arthur sitting in the rocking chair telling an old story. There was her father standing by the stove making coffee for everyone. And there she was, finally at peace, finally knowing what it was to truly live. It wasn't a perfect life, it wasn't a life without pain or difficulties, but it was a life where there was love, where there was presence, where there was hope. And sometimes that is all you need to transform suffering into strength, pain into growth, silence into voice. Clara touched the silver bracelet she still wore on her wrist, feeling the letters H and E with affection, and smiled. Her mother would be proud. She had survived, had protected Michael, had found strength where there seemed to be none. And now, finally, she could live. Not just survive, but truly live. With all the joys and sorrows that life brings, but with the certainty that she was no longer alone, that she had a father who was learning to love, a brother who loved unconditionally, and a kind old man who had been an angel when they needed it most. She had a family, imperfect, but real. And that was more than enough. Edward looked at his daughter and noticed the smile on her face. It was a small smile, but genuine, and he knew they were on the right path. It wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the beginning of something new. A fresh start he had almost lost by being blind, by being absent, by being trapped in his own fears. But now he was here. He was present. He was trying. And he would continue trying every day for the rest of his life. Because he had learned, in the most painful way possible, that it is not enough to offer shelter. One must learn to stay. One must be present, even when it is difficult. One must love, even when one does not know how. One must always try. And as the sun set over the farm, painting the sky orange and pink, as the sound of cicadas filled the air and the smell of fresh coffee spread across the porch, that small family finally found something akin to peace. It wasn't the fairy tale happy ending. It was something better. It was real life with all its imperfections, but all, with the promise that together they could face anything. And that promise, built on truth, regret, and love, was stronger than anything else. 3 years had passed since that afternoon at Old Man Arthur's farm, when Clara had smiled looking at her mother's bracelet and felt, for the first time in a long time, that life was worth living. Now at 15, she was a different young woman from that frightened girl who had walked down the dirt road holding Michael's hand. Her hair had grown long, reaching her waist, and she tied it in a high ponytail when she went to school. She had gained weight. Her face was no longer pale and gaunt. There was color in her cheeks, a sparkle in her eyes. But more than the physical transformation, it was the inner change that truly impressed those who knew her. Clara had found her voice. At school she excelled in literature and writing. Her texts were deep, full of emotion, but also of hope. Her English teacher, Mrs. Marissa, a woman with round glasses and a gentle smile, always encouraged her to keep writing. She said Clara had a rare gift, the ability to transform pain into beauty, to touch people's hearts with words. Clara had started writing a book, a story about 2 sisters who faced adversity and discovered the strength within themselves. She wrote at night, after everyone was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with only a lamp on, the words flowing as if they had a life of their own. Edward sometimes woke up and found her there, completely immersed in the world she was creating. He didn't interrupt her, just watched from the doorway, his heart full of pride. Michael, now 9 years old, was a boy full of energy and creativity. He still loved to draw, but had also discovered a passion for football. Edward had enrolled him in a local children's team, and Michael trained 3 times a week. He wasn't the best player, but he was the most dedicated, always the first to arrive and the last to leave the field. Edward never missed a game. He was always there in the makeshift stands, shouting encouragement, celebrating every goal as if it were a World Cup victory. The other children sometimes commented on how present Michael's father was, how he was always there. Michael smiled proudly, knowing it hadn't always been that way, but grateful that it was now. The house in the center of Silverwood Heights had truly become a home. The walls were filled with photographs, moments captured over the years. Michael blowing out candles on his 7th birthday, Clara receiving an award at school for best essay, Edward, Clara and Michael at Old Man Arthur's farm, all smiling. There was also a framed photo of Helen, placed in a prominent spot in the living room. Edward had learned that he didn't need to erase the past to build the future. Helen was part of their story, and it was important for the children to remember her, to honor her memory. He himself had learned to talk about her without guilt paralyzing him. He told stories to the children about how Helen loved music, about how she sang off-key, but with such enthusiasm that she made everyone laugh, about how she made the best carrot cake in the world. But not everything was perfect. Clara still had nightmares sometimes, dreams where she was back in that cold house, being reprimanded by Sylvia, seeing her father turn his back. She woke up sweating, her heart pounding, and it took her a few minutes to remember where she was, to realize she was safe. Edward had placed a bell beside her bed, something she could ring if she needed help during the night. Sometimes she rang it, and Edward appeared in seconds, still in his pajamas, his eyes full of concern. He sat on the edge of the bed, held her hand, and stayed there until she fell back asleep. They didn't need many words. His presence was enough. Michael also had his difficult moments. He had developed a fear of being locked in enclosed spaces, a clear consequence of that day. Sylvia had locked him in the room. Whenever he entered an elevator or a small room, he would start to sweat coldly, his breathing becoming labored. Edward and Clara had learned to deal with this, always leaving doors open, always ensuring Michael knew he could leave whenever he wanted. The psychologist said that with time it would get better, that Michael's brain was just trying to protect him from something that had hurt him, and little by little, it really was improving. He could stay in enclosed spaces for longer, could control his anxiety. Old man Arthur continued to be an important presence in their lives. The old man had turned 75, and his health was beginning to falter. He had developed knee problems, which made farm work difficult. Edward, noticing his friend's difficulties, suggested he come live with them in town. Old man Arthur resisted at first, saying he didn't want to be a burden, that he was used to country life. But Edward insisted, saying it wasn't charity. It was family, taking care of family. And old man Arthur, hearing the word family, felt his eyes well up. He accepted. Old man Arthur's move to their home brought a new dynamic. The old man occupied the rarely used guest room and quickly made that space his own little corner. He put old photos on the walls, brought some books he had kept for decades, hung a worn straw hat on the hanger. In the morning, he woke up early and prepared coffee, the strong smell filling the house and waking everyone up. Clara loved waking up to that smell. It reminded her of the days on the farm, when everything was beginning to rebuild. Old man Arthur helped Michael with his homework, told him stories before bed, taught Clara how to make traditional English pastries that he had learned from his mother decades ago. He became the grandfather the children had never had. Edward, in turn, continued to grow as a father and as a person. He had drastically reduced his working hours, delegating more responsibilities to partners and managers. He realized that the money he earned had no value if he couldn't enjoy it with the people he loved. He began to seek balance, working enough to maintain financial stability, but prioritizing being present. He never again missed a school presentation of Michael's, never again failed to read the texts Clara wrote, never again failed to be there when old man Arthur needed to go to the doctor. He had learned, in the hardest way possible, that presence cannot be replaced by anything. It was on a Thursday afternoon that something unexpected happened. Clara was walking home from school along the main street of Silverwood Heights when she saw a woman standing in front of a shop, looking at the display window. There was something familiar about that figure, something that made Clara's heart pound. The woman turned her face and Clara froze. It was Sylvia, older with shorter hair and some grey strands, but it was her. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Clara saw something in Sylvia's gaze that she couldn't decipher. Was it regret? Was it fear? Was it anger? She didn't know. Sylvia quickly looked away and entered the shop, disappearing from view. Clara stood paralyzed in the middle of the sidewalk, people passing around her, but she couldn't move. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her temples. Her breathing was difficult. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, she managed to force herself to walk, her steps trembling, her body shaking. She didn't go into the shop, didn't want to confront Sylvia, didn't know what she would say if she did. She just walked home as fast as she could, almost running the last few blocks. When she arrived, Edward was in the living room reviewing some documents. He looked at his daughter and immediately realized something was wrong. Clara was pale, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. Edward quickly stood up, went to her and asked what had happened. Clara tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. She could only tremble, hugging her own body as if she were cold. Edward guided her to the sofa, sat beside her, took her hands in his, and waited. Slowly, Clara managed to calm down enough to tell him. She said she had seen Sylvia, that she was in town, that their eyes had met. Edward felt anger rising within him, but forced himself to remain calm. He asked if Sylvia had said anything, if she had approached her. Clara shook her head, said no, that the woman had just entered the shop and disappeared. Edward took a deep breath, trying to process that information. Sylvia was back in Silverwood Heights. Why? What did she want? Was it just a coincidence, or did she have a plan? He told Clara to relax, that he wouldn't let anything happen, that they were safe. But inside, he was worried. He decided that the next day he would investigate. He would find out what Sylvia was doing in town, whether she was living there or just passing through. He needed to know if there was any danger, if he needed to take any legal action to protect the children. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Sylvia, about everything that had happened years ago, about the fear she still felt. She thought she had overcome it, that she had left it behind, but seeing Sylvia had brought everything back. Memories flooded her mind, each one more painful than the last. The endless chores, the punishments, the silences, the constant feeling of not being good enough. Clara clutched her mother's bracelet on her wrist, seeking comfort in that object that always accompanied her. Helen, if she were there, what would she say? What would she do? Clara imagined her mother sitting on the edge of the bed, running her hand through her hair, saying that everything was okay, that she was strong, that she would overcome it. And little by little, with that image in mind, she finally managed to fall asleep. Edward, meanwhile, spent the night awake. He stayed in the living room, thinking, planning, trying to decide what to do. The next morning, as soon as the banks opened, he called the lawyer who had handled the custody case. He explained the situation, said Sylvia had been seen in town. The lawyer said that legally there wasn't much to do, as Sylvia hadn't committed any crime, hadn't approached the children, hadn't violated any court order. But he recommended that Edward remain vigilant, document any attempted contact, and keep the children informed so they wouldn't be caught by surprise. Edward decided to investigate on his own. He went to the shop where Clara had seen Sylvia and asked the employees if they knew the woman. A saleswoman said yes, that she had come in to ask about a job, that she was looking for work in town. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. Sylvia wasn't just passing through. She was planning to stay. He asked if the woman had left any contact information or where she was staying. The saleswoman, noticing the tension in Edward's voice, hesitated, but eventually said that Sylvia had mentioned staying at a simple guest house at the edge of town near the bus station. Edward went there. It was a small guest house with peeling paint and a faded sign. He entered the reception and asked the owner if a woman was staying there, describing Sylvia. The owner confirmed, said she had been there for a week, paying daily in cash. Edward asked to speak with her, said it was important. The owner went to the room and returned a few minutes later, saying the woman wasn't there, that she had left early and hadn't returned yet. Edward left a message. He told the owner to inform Sylvia that Edward Lawson wanted to speak with her and left his phone number. He returned home, his stomach churning with nervousness. He didn't know if Sylvia would call, didn't know what he would say if she did, but he knew he had to face her. He needed to make it clear that she was not welcome, that she could not approach the children, that they were happy and safe, and he would not allow anything to change that. The phone rang late in the afternoon. Edward answered, his heart pounding. It was Sylvia. Her voice was different, lower, more tired. She said she had received the message, asked if they could meet. Edward agreed, arranging to meet at a cafe in the main square, a public place where there would be no risks. The next day, Edward arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. He sat at a table near the window, ordered a black coffee and waited, his eyes fixed on the door. Sylvia entered punctually, looking around until she found him. She walked to the table, her posture rigid, and sat down without asking permission. The two remained silent for a moment, measuring each other, evaluating each other. Sylvia was different, not just physically older, but there was something broken in her, something that wasn't there before. She seemed smaller, more fragile, as if the years had stripped away all the arrogance she used to carry. Sylvia was the first to speak. She said she knew Edward didn't want to see her, that she understood, but that she needed to say some things. Edward just nodded, letting her continue. Sylvia began to speak, her voice trembling at first, but gaining firmness as she went on. She recounted that after leaving Silverwood Heights, she had gone to London, tried to start over. But things hadn't worked out. She had found some temporary jobs, but never anything stable. She had lived in cheap boarding houses, endured hardship, felt firsthand what it was like to be alone and helpless. And throughout that time, she had thought about the children, about Clara and Michael, about everything she had done, and she deeply regretted it. Edward listened to everything without interrupting, his face expressionless. When Sylvia finished, he waited a few seconds before speaking. He said that regret was easy, that anyone could regret when facing the consequences of their actions. He asked what she wanted, why she had returned, what she hoped to achieve. Sylvia lowered her eyes, her hands trembling around the teacup she had ordered. She said she didn't want anything, that she didn't expect forgiveness, that she just wanted Edward to know that she had changed, that she was no longer the same person, and that if one day, perhaps many years in the future, the children wanted to hear what she had to say, she would be available, but that she understood if that never happened. Edward remained silent, processing those words. There was sincerity in Sylvia's voice, he perceived, but there was also a lot of damage done, a lot of pain caused. He told her, firmly but without anger, that she had made terrible choices, that she had hurt innocent children, that she had destroyed any chance of having a family. He said that Clara and Michael were fine now, that they were happy, that they were healing, or at least on the path to healing, and that he would not allow anything or anyone to jeopardize that. He said that Sylvia could stay in Silverwood Heights if she wished. The town belonged to everyone, but that she should not, under any circumstances, approach the children, that if he knew of any attempt at contact, he would take the necessary legal measures. Sylvia nodded, tears streaming down her face. She said she understood, that she would respect it, and that she just wanted Edward to tell the children when they were older, when they could understand that she had apologized, that she had acknowledged her mistakes. Edward promised nothing, just stood up, left money on the table to pay for the coffees, and left. He didn't look back. As he walked back home, he felt a mixture of emotions. Anger, yes, there was still anger, but also a strange sense of closure. Sylvia had returned, had apologized, and now he knew she no longer posed a threat. He could move forward without that fear in the back of his mind. When he arrived home, he found Clara, sitting on the porch writing on her notebook. She looked at her father, her eyes full of questions. Edward sat beside her and told her everything. He said he had met Sylvia, that he had talked to her, that the woman had apologized. Clara listened in silence, her face strained. When Edward finished, she asked if he believed Sylvia had truly changed. Edward hesitated, then said he didn't know, that people could change, but that didn't erase what they had done. That regret was important, but forgiveness was not obligatory, that Clara didn't need to forgive Sylvia, not now, perhaps, never, and that it was okay. Clara nodded, feeling a strange relief. She didn't know if she would ever be able to forgive Sylvia, didn't know if she wanted to, but knowing that the woman had acknowledged her mistakes, that she had apologized, somehow lightened a little of the weight she carried. She looked at her father and said she was grateful for everything he had done, for protecting her, for changing, for being there. Edward felt his eyes well up. He hugged his daughter, holding her tightly, and said there was nothing in the world that made him happier than being her and Michael's father. The following days returned to normal. Sylvia made no attempt at contact. Clara gradually stopped looking over her shoulder every time she left the house. The tension eased. Life continued, with its routines, its challenges, its joys. Clara continued writing, Michael continued playing football, Old Man Arthur continued telling stories, Edward continued being present. And together, they continued to build a family that, though born of suffering, was based on love, respect, and presence. A family that had learned that the past does not define the future, that it is possible to start over, that it is possible to heal, and that sometimes the strongest families are those that were broken and had to rebuild themselves piece by piece, day after day, with patience, with love, with hope.